right, lesson 19 is something called the long-run aggregate supply curve. In our last lesson, we learned a lot about the short-run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve, what they are and what caused them to shift and what impact that shift had on prices and our GDP. I suppose if you realize there was a short-run aggregate supply curve, it's not going to be a big surprise that we're going to discuss now the long-run aggregate supply curve. So what is this curve? Well, this is what it looks like. The long-run aggregate supply curve, you'll first notice, is completely vertical, or if you took microeconomics, you might also say that it is perfectly inelastic. Well, what does that actually mean? Well, what it means, first of all, in this case, if we look at our graph, is that it seems that whether our price level is very high or our price level is very low, it doesn't seem to have any impact on our RGDP. It stays exactly the same. It moves up and down the price level, but the RGDP doesn't seem to change. That's an interesting fact. Why is that? Well, here's why it is. In the long run, what that actually means is that all markets are working essentially the way they're supposed to. Remember, the aggregate economy is all of the markets in our economy essentially combined as one. Well, when they all work properly, when they're all working at their equilibriums, then we have what's called the long run in macroeconomics. The reality is that we never really get there, and we'll get to that point in a minute. But if you think of it that way, here's what it means. If, for example, we did have a rise in prices, let's say, for example, that a can of soda went from $1 to $2. Well, if at the same time everyone's wages also went from $1 to $2, then what real effect, and I'm using that word real, what real effect would that have on the economy? The truth is, none at all. That's what happens in the long run. As prices change, everything has caught up. So, yes, prices are changing, but so are all the other prices, so are wages, so are everything else. And so the actual effect of price on the amount of stuff that we want to consume and produce is none. Remember, in the short run, the issue was that some of those wages lagged behind prices. And so because of that, that supply curve was upward sloping, but not perfectly vertical. In other words, prices did have some effect on how much producers were willing to produce. In the long run, that's not true. Now, as I said a minute ago, that never really happens. But wouldn't it be nice to know what we should be producing if, in fact, everything was working the way it was supposed to in the long run? Well, it is a nice thing to know, and that's why we put it there. The long-run aggregate supply curve, think of it as sort of the end zone. It's sort of our goal line. It's the thing we're going to shoot for. You'll also notice that that point that we produce at when we reach the long run is so important that we actually give it a special name. We call it full employment, and we've talked about full employment already this year. In other words, it's when we are the amount of stuff we're producing, the amount of GDP we're producing, that we are fully employing or fully using our resources as best as we possibly can. And by the way, that point's so important, we label it with a Y star. That's what the long-run aggregate supply curve looks like. And again, we're going to use it sort of as a benchmarker. So what should our economy look like if that's the case? Well, here we go. By the way, just as a reminder, here's how it would look graphically. As prices decrease, the RGDP does not change. That's true in the long run. Now, again, that's sort of just a theory. What we really want to do is use the long-run aggregate supply curve as a goal. And here's what we're going to look at. Here's what the long-run aggregate supply curve looks like again. But I want you to notice something. What you're going to notice here is our short-run aggregate supply curve and our aggregate demand curve come into play. The reality is it's the short run in which we live every single day, and that's really what economists are paying attention to. Again, the long run is really just there to provide us sort of a goal. Now, at this moment, because the short-run supply curve and the aggregate demand curve meet at the GDP where the long-run aggregate supply curve is, that actually is a really good thing. And that means we are at what's called, at the top of the screen, long-run equilibrium, or also known as full employment. And again, we're going to label that point Y star. We also label the point of equilibrium price. This is what our price actually is at the moment, and we happen to be at full employment. This is what we want our economy to do. We are essentially employing exactly the right amount of resources in our economy. And again, this is sort of a goal that economists strive for. So kind of have this picture in your mind. This is where we want to be. And again, we're going to call it two names, either long-run equilibrium or full employment. However, it doesn't always work that well. Sometimes we end up out of long-run equilibrium. And in fact, most of the time, we run out of long-run equilibrium. By the way, on this graph, I'm going to begin using the abbreviations, which we generally consider to be acceptable when you do your graphing problems. You'll notice that price level has been replaced with just P. That's fine. RGDP/output is just RGDP, and long-run aggregate supply curve is just LRAS. That's fine. Okay, so again, here we have our short-run aggregate supply curve, again labeled just AS. We know that's the short-run curve. But notice where the aggregate demand curve is here in this case. You'll see that that's shifted to the left from where it was originally. That is what we call a recession. That's how recessions happen. Aggregate demand decreases from where it should be when it's at full employment. For some reason, there's not enough consumption or investment or government spending or exporting to make aggregate demand go all the way to GDP. It is, to full employment GDP. It has shifted to the left for some reason. Now, what does that actually mean? By the way, it has two titles. We'll either call it a recession, as you see at the top of the screen, or below full employment. That's the other term we'll use for it. Now, you'll notice that in this case, prices are quite low, generally speaking, on this graph. But what you'll also notice is that we've labeled not only P1, but also Y1. Y1 is what we call the current GDP, the actual amount of GDP we're producing. Y star still represents where we want to be, but Y1 represents what we actually are producing. And again, in this case, you'll notice it's below full employment. And as we learned in our last lesson, when GDP decreases, what's happening is unemployment is increasing. And as I noted at the top of the screen, high unemployment is the problem that we're facing in a recession. What causes all this to happen? Aggregate demand to be too low for some reason. This is called a recession. Now, it is very possible the opposite can happen. Though it's not quite as frequent, what can happen at the same time is, again, we have our aggregate supply curve, but this time we notice the aggregate demand curve is actually too far to the right. We call this either an inflationary gap or above full employment. In this case, the problem is actually that our prices have risen too much. Our prices are high, our inflation is occurring. Now remember, why does inflation occur when aggregate demand rises? Because essentially what's happening here is that we are producing or asking to produce more than we really can. People want to consume more than what the economy should be producing. Remember, Y star tells us the amount of GDP we should be producing. Y1 now is what we actually are producing, our current GDP. And it's actually more than our economy can really handle. So what's the only solution that producers have to solve that problem? To raise prices. And that's where inflation kicks in. So our problem when we have too much aggregate demand is high inflation. Our prices are essentially too high. By the way, this arrow is an inverted, that shouldn't be there. By the way, it's also worth noting that in a sense, our unemployment is actually too low. At Y star, we have no cyclical unemployment, but we have the unemployment that, remember, that we like, structural, frictional, and seasonal unemployment. We actually need some of that. At Y1, we actually are beginning to cut into what we might call our good unemployment. I say it this way, at Y1, you may really have to hire a painter to be an electrician. That's not necessarily a good thing for the economy either. And so this, though it might not seem like it at first, too much spending, too much consumption and investment is also a problem and is what's called an inflationary gap. Okay, lastly, we're going to look at what many economists might consider the worst situation, which is when we have both high inflation and high unemployment. Now, this shouldn't be too hard to figure out. Here's our aggregate supply curve initially. Here's our initial aggregate demand curve. And remember, this is what we would like to see. We would like to see them meet at LAS or LRAS. That's full employment. But sometimes what happens is instead of aggregate demand getting out of whack, aggregate supply gets out of whack. Aggregate supply shifts, instead of being here at full employment, it shifts to the left. And there's our new aggregate supply curve. This is what's called stagflation. Sort of a play on the words stagnation and inflation smushed together. Here we have both problems, high inflation and high unemployment. So first let's take a look. What happens? First we know output is falling, and because output is falling, we know that GDP is decreasing, therefore less people are being employed, so we have unemployment rising. We also notice that prices are rising, and because prices are rising, we are getting inflation mixed into the situation. We have both problems now, and again, what causes this to happen? Something that causes aggregate supply to shift to the left. This is also a problem that economists are going to have to deal with. Now, we haven't gotten into either case yet, whether it was a recession, inflationary gap, or stagflation, how economists go about trying to tackle these issues. We just want to understand what they are first in this lesson. And to kind of help wrap things up, I'd like you to take a look at this little summary chart and remind ourselves, when each of the situations outside of full employment is when we're happy, or long-run equilibrium is when we're happy. When we're not there, these are the other problems we might face. And this chart summarizes how they happen, the cause, the problem it creates when that happens. For example, in a recession, you'll notice it's high unemployment, and also reminds you about some other names that we might use to describe the same thing. I will note just briefly, one of the terms we sometimes use for stagflation is what's called a supply shock. I didn't use that on the last slide, but it's good to just mention it here.